When one thinks microfinance, one typically thinks empowerment, poverty alleviation, and almost also of a democratization of the financial sector. But in reality, in the last few years, there's been a very heated debate about whether microfinance actually works at all as a concept to help poverty alleviation, and also a heated debate on some of the moral compasses of some of the micro lenders. And to discuss this issue with me today, we have Jason Hickel, who is a fellow of the London School of Economics. So thanks a lot for joining us.
My pleasure. Yeah, thank you.
So Jason, you recently wrote a piece on The Guardian that basically challenged, let's say, microfinance as a concept and as a tool to alleviate poverty. And one of your arguments was that it sometimes does not work, but it actually sometimes even leaves some of the borrowers worse off. How does this come about?
Right. Well, I guess the first thing to understand is just that all of the studies that have been coming out in the past couple of years have demonstrated pretty clearly that there's no net positive impact from microfinance programs. So we've had a study coming out of the Center for Global Development, a big DFID study, and recently a study from the Poverty Action Lab, all essentially showing the same thing, and that's that while in some instances microfinance does help certain individuals, and this is where we get the anecdotal evidence from that supports microfinance, as a sort of across-the-board issue, on average, it doesn't help anybody. And in many cases actually makes the problem worse for people. And the reason for that is basically that the majority, in many contexts, of microfinance borrowers spend the money that they borrow on consumption. Mm-hmm. And as a result, so in South Africa, for example, which is where I do my research, some 94% of all microfinance borrowing is spent on consumption. And as a result, the borrowers are unable to fund the businesses they may be planned on putting up, and so they have no profits to pay back the loans, and so they get stuck in kind of these layers of
a
these
debt
cycles
vicious
of debt.
cycle, basically.
Exactly, yeah. So in some cases, of course, the businesses do succeed, but what happens then quite often is what we call displacement, where the businesses provide the same basic goods and services that already existing businesses were providing, and so they essentially just push those businesses out of the market, yielding no net increase in employment or incomes. And what happens probably more often is the businesses fail, and the reason they fail is because they essentially encounter a lack of consumer demand, because the people in their neighborhoods are very poor and they can only afford basic items that already tend to be on offer, and so there's really no customer base for them. So it's a lack of aggregate demand.
And also, I guess one of the key issues in this context is the very high interest rates that some of these microloans actually have. So when we look at one of the most controversial examples, I guess, of microlending, Banco Compartamos in Mexico, it has interest rates, I think in 2013, were over 100%. And I guess that is quite an interesting story because it is a very profitable and successful bank. As a banking entity, it has one of the highest return on equities, I think around 43%. In 2013, but at the end of the day, the interest rates are very high. So is this one of the key issues with the microlenders?
Yeah, I mean, it's clearly a very big issue. I mean, for many people, they think of microfinance as kind of a charitable endeavor, but that's just not the case, especially these days. A lot of the major microfinance lenders are, profit-making banks, and yeah, I mean, rates are extremely high, even among sort of more charitable organizations. They're very high. They're higher than you or I would ever pay if we went to get a loan right now for ourselves, right? And in some cases, they reach as high as 100 or 200%, mm-hmm. Which is, of course, impossible for poor people to ever repay.
Exactly. And I guess, as I said, your article is very critical of microfinance as a tool to alleviate poverty. But actually there was an article published by the American Economic Journal that sort of analyzes 6 different countries. And what they do say is, yes, it is true, there are no clear evidence of, increases in household income, decreases in poverty, or, improving social indicators. But at the same time, they saw that there was some sort of a mixed bag of improvements in terms of greater freedom of choice, in terms of where you want to allocate your labor, for example, or increased consumption in some durable goods, or in cases also increases in empowerment. So do you think that actually we shouldn't write off microfinance as a whole, I guess, too easily? Because especially for groups like women that are at a disadvantage in some of these less developed countries, having even that small increment in empowerment could be essential.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's no question that, look, in some instances, for some people in some countries, microfinance can work. There's no question. In aggregate, it appears not to work very well, but that's not to say that it might not help some people, right? Even if at the expense of other people. And certainly, it can certainly lead to empowerment in some kinds of situations. Whether or not it is a definitive empowering tool for women, the jury is really out on that. I mean, certainly it's important, obviously, that women have equal access to credit alongside men. But there's lots of data suggesting that that women who take out microfinance loans actually end up in relationships that are even more abusive than the ones that they were in previously. And the reason is because when they end up not being able to repay them, then they get stuck in deeper cycles of debt. And this leads to kind of cycles of violence within the home.
And I guess the key issue here is that one of the sort of arguments that you make is that microfinance could be actually looked at as an economic and maybe even a political quick fix for probably issues that are creating poverty in the first place, that are far more sort of deep-rooted and structurally complex. And in your article, for example, you write structural problems require structural solutions.
Mm-hmm.
So what are these problems in your opinion, and in what ways should we be tackling them?
Yeah, no, good question. So, I mean, for me, one of the problems with microfinance is that it regards poverty as kind of a problem that just exists out there, as though it has no cause. But we know that poverty is caused by particular kinds of institutions and particular kinds of economic processes. The most recent example for us would be the food price crisis that happened beginning in 2007, 2008, 2009, 2010, that was driven by reckless speculation on food markets in the global south by Wall Street banks and by here in the city of London, which pushed 150 plus million people in the global south into hunger. Right? That's by conservative estimates. And so what those people need is not microfinance loans, obviously. They need a fair financial system that's not going to speculate rapaciously on their food systems. But the causes of poverty, in terms of understanding that there's structural drivers, we have to go back to like the 1980s, really, when structural adjustment programs were pushed on global south countries, 1990s as well, which to this day remains the biggest single cause of poverty in the developing world. I mean, I think the stats now are that the global south countries lost in the region of $500 billion per year in potential GDP as a result of structural adjustment. Mm-hmm. So structural adjustment was excellent for Western institutions, companies and banks and so on, but ended up being devastating for poor countries. And the problem is the IMF has recognized this. The problem is it's being continued under these new poverty reduction strategy programs by the World Bank. I mean, really, the question I want to ask is, if we're serious about solving the problem of global poverty, we have to look at the basic unfairness of the global economy, right, and how that's producing poverty in the first place.
So I guess doing the kind of analysis that you were doing, sort of looking at the net benefits of microfinance, it sort of pushes you to sort of question also the broader picture and to sort of dig deeper and look at why the problem that microfinance is trying to fix exists in the first place. So thank you very much for joining us, Jason.
Thanks very much. Yeah.
Thanks.